Hello, hello, welcome to another episode of History in the Dark. I am your host, Darkness the Curse, and before we begin, as always, thank you so much to my generous Patreons, my British rail critics, and my underwater train finders, Thomas Ward and Lord Captain Von Thrust III. You are the reason why this content remains wild and wonderful. And today, we're going to talk about another train versus a thing, and this one comes to us from the beautiful country of Norway, and it involves a locomotive and a moose? What? These stories keep getting weirder. I don't know what's going on with this channel. Like, I just keep digging into this rabbit hole of weird stuff involving trains, and it's just eternal. It just keeps going, and yeah. As it turns out, trains run into, well, animals pretty often. And it's unfortunate, but it is just kind of a fact of life. In fact, there was an incident in 2017 where over 100 reindeer were killed by a train in Norway. Now, that's kind of a high bar. It doesn't usually get that bad. As other countries in the north will probably tell you, large animals just chilling on the railway lines up there is not something that's unusual, whether it be in Alaska or Canada, and Norway by extension. And even down here in countries that are closer to the equator, I mean, how often do deer get hit by cars or other animals? In fact, if you drive, I'm sure you've dodged a handful of animals in your time. Once I even struck a deer, which I felt really bad about as it was just a baby, but it was something that just occurred. It came out of nowhere. It happens. I'm not a hunter myself, and I don't like killing things, but as long as we're using these vehicles, we have to remember that other animals share the planet with us, and that sometimes those animals will wind up in the way. You'd think animals would learn to avoid train tracks as they're pretty obvious, but sometimes it just doesn't happen, particularly in more rural areas where the trains are a little less frequent. But we're not talking about just any animal in this case, because the specific incident derailed the train. And how often does an animal derail the train? Land-based animals usually aren't large enough to cause that kind of issue for a locomotive. I say usually because there are exceptions, of course, and one of the exceptions happens to be the Great Northern Moose. Now, it's important for me to stress at this time that we call it a moose here in North America, but over in Norway, they would actually refer to this animal as an elk, which is super confusing because back over here in North America, we call an entire different member of the deer family, also rather large, an elk. But for the sake of clarity, this is what I'm talking about when I say moose. Big, giant moose. Moose are in fact the largest and heaviest extant species in the deer family. They have huge antlers, massive bodies, and male members of the species can weigh over 1,500 pounds. Moose are also kind of dangerous. Unlike our friendly white-tailed deer here in America that generally won't attack you unless it's mating season and it's a buck in a grumpy mood, moose are pretty territorial. And they're big, so they can do a lot of damage if they decide they don't like you. So I'm going to stress at this time that if you ever run into a moose, just don't bother it. Just leave it alone. Alright? Moose don't like to be bothered. They don't like to be bothered. They're pretty chill normally, but they will mess you up. And cars have struck moose before, and in many cases the moose literally walks away. The car doesn't. But a train is different. A train is still going to be a lot heavier than a moose. But even at that, a moose is still big on its own, and it could cause damage to the train. The locomotive involved was hard for me to figure out, as none of the sources specifically say what it was. However, based on the fact that this was a freight train, and the timing involved, I'm going to go out on a limb and say it was probably an EMD Class 66, which was originally developed for use as British Rail, under the same category. However, many countries in mainland Europe actually took EMD up on the offering of the Class 66, and one of them was Norway. Unlike the British Rail Class 59, which as we talked about before, was actually built from an SD40-2, Class 66 was built more from the ground up. They're pretty good diesels all around, that's why they've had so many customers. But on that day, one finally ran into a worthy opponent. A moose. The moose in question did not have a name, did not have a title. We don't even know what kind of history it would have had. After all, it was a mysterious moose that came out of nowhere. Actually, it probably didn't even come out of nowhere. More likely, it just stood in the track and moose don't care about you, or your Honda Civic it just destroyed, or the Class 66 carrying a load of iron ore heading straight towards him. It was August 18th, 2006, a Monday, and it happened on the line between Trondheim and Bodo. That's a very northern part of the line. It actually crosses the Arctic Circle up there. Under normal situations, a locomotive would blow its horn and attempt to get the animal off. In this instance, the moose did not move. Animals sometimes will do this, and unlike with cars where we could slam on our brakes and hope for the best, train drivers really can't do anything. I mean, they could brake, but there's no way they'd be able to stop in time, so they just blow their horn and hope they get off. The moose didn't. Normally, an animal would be small enough that a train would simply run over it and keep going. It's unfortunate, but it happens. But a moose is a little bit different, because a moose is very, very big, very heavy, very sturdy, and it was enough of a hindrance on the line that it did cause the locomotive to derail. None of the sources I have mention any injury, so it's likely the crew was fine. But the derailment was bad enough, and in a remote enough region, that the cleanup took some time. This part of the line was also frequented by their passenger trains, and service didn't return to normal until that Friday, because of a moose. It's not something you would expect to cripple a rail network, and to be honest, I'm not sure there was any way to avoid this problem. Even if you put fences around the lines, which would take a lot of time and money, moose don't care about that either. They would literally just go over the fences. Moose kind of stand as a last remnant of Ice Age megafauna. They're not as big as those animals were, but they're pretty close. And I guess the lesson here is, look, if ever you're thinking about messing with a moose, you think it might be funny, maybe it'll get you some nice views on TikTok if you get super close to that moose. Yeah, okay, you know what's gonna get you a lot of views on TikTok? Getting mauled and stomped on and destroyed by the moose you decided to harass. Leave them alone. They do not want to be bothered. Please, they're scary. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.